Throughout the months of July and August 1902, a series of violent protests broke out across the Department of Finistère in Brittany against the introduction of the 1901 Law of Associations. Aimed at the many religious congregations that have been operating schools in the department throughout the century, the Law of Associations forced the closure of non-compliant congregational schools and saw many teaching sisters expelled from their homes. The implementation of this law was a bitter and protracted process in Brittany, as authorities faced anger from local populations who had long accessed the services provided by these women. While this law took effect nationwide following its introduction in 1901, the most significant and notable forms of resistance were seen in this Catholic stronghold, where regionalism combined with religious fervour. Of particular note was the reaction of locals to the closure of the 38 schools held by the largest and most important Breton teaching congregation, the Filles du Saint-Esprit. In this paper today, I seek to bring to light the response of the Filles du Saint-Esprit to the introduction of the Law of Associations. The story of this law, amongst the introduction of other anti-clerical policies at the fin de siècle, is not an unknown story within the historiography. The effect such legislation had on the existence of French religious congregations and the way in which ordinary people protested its introduction has attracted the attention of some historians, such as Sarah Curtis and Caroline Ford. Ford's work in particular has been especially pivotal in constructing this story within the Breton context, from the perspective of the ordinary Breton population and the government representatives present during the protests. Nevertheless, there has been little examination and little consensus reached regarding the actions taken by the congregations themselves during this period. By drawing attention to the congregational voice and positioning the Filles du Saint-Esprit at the centre of the analysis, in this paper today, I aim to shed new light on the actions taken by congregational women during this important moment in their history. By so doing, I aim to make greater sense of the ways in which these congregational women integrated themselves into the Breton landscape, socially, economically, and politically, as they became key players in the Church's fight for the continuation of a Catholic France. To achieve this, my research draws on letters and other materials produced by the women themselves during this period, which are held in the private archives of the Filles du Saint-Esprit. Until now, these materials have been inaccessible to historians within the field, and as such they can provide new and valuable insight into the experience of expulsion and how congregational women understood the introduction of anti-clerical legislation. This case study is taken from a chapter of my master's thesis in which I examined the response of both the Filles du Saint-Esprit and local villages to the introduction of this law within the context of the culture wars during the Third Republic. As Claude Langlois' work revealed in great detail, 19th century France saw the notable rise of female religious congregations. Throughout the century, record numbers of women chose to give up their worldly goods and professed vows to live a religious life. Facilitated by the increasingly favourable political circumstances of the first half of the century, during which certain privileges were afforded to congregations who were willing to live active rather than contemplative lives, by 1861, as many as 104,000 women across the country were congregational members. Of particular note were laws such as the Falloux Law that was introduced with the support of the Emperor Louis Napoleon in 1850, and which gave the vast majority of both male and female religious the right to work as teachers. Groups like the subjects of this paper, the Filles du Saint-Esprit, became particularly known for their role as educators in the regions, away from the major urban centres, which continued to experience relatively high rates of illiteracy even by the latter part of the century, and where a lack of access to education particularly affected young girls. While religious congregations across France had become central to the education of children throughout the century, and women religious particularly important for the education of girls, often from impoverished families, from the 1880s onwards, the regime of the Third Republic implemented a range of laws that intended to decrease the power of religious schooling across France, while also developing a secular public system. Part of this broader anti-clerical program, the 1901 Law of Associations was a significant blow to the work of many female congregations, for whom teaching had become the backbone of their organisations over the course of the century. This law brought these groups under stricter governmental control by mandating that all congregations seek reauthorization from the state in order to maintain their schools, and ruling that any religious congregation could be dissolved by ministerial decree. For many congregations, the passing of this legislation was a shock, as the life and legacy of their organisations became increasingly uncertain. The ecclesiastical superior of the Filles du Saint-Esprit, the Bishop of Saint-Brieuc, wrote in the Filles du Saint-Esprit's annual bulletin La Colombe that this was, quote, the most violent of attacks against all religious congregations. He claimed that, quote, La Colombe is not a political bulletin, but when political questions arise on which the fate of the congregation rests, there is a duty to not leave its readers in ignorance, end quote. He asked that all readers and members of the congregation find a symbol of confidence and hope within the bulletin's pages, and that their faith continue to guide their actions during this dark period. In the wake of this law, many congregations scrambled to receive certification within the required 3-month window. But despite Morel's grave tone in the congregation's bulletin, this law provoked little sense of urgency from the Filles du Saint-Esprit, who refused authorization and continued their work in the region as usual. The position taken by the Filles du Saint-Esprit changed dramatically in July of 1902, however, when, under instructions from the Minister of the Interior and Religion, Émile Combes, local prefect of Finistère, Henri Collignon, introduced a new order that threatened all non-compliant congregational schools in his department with expulsion. Collignon's order focused exclusively on the schools operating in his department, but its effects were felt congregation-wide and sent shockwaves through the group, who were immediately spurred into action. Following the news of this order, Superior General Sir Saint-Georges wrote a circular letter of advice and reassurance to all women in the congregation. She announced that, quote, the long-awaited moment of our expulsion seems very near, end quote, and offered practical advice for their removal, including to pack their bags and to secure all valuable items in a safe place. Importantly, she ordered her filles to, quote, not barricade yourselves in your houses, remain calm, but only leave when forced, showing with dignity that you know of no law which forbids you to occupy a house offered to you by your founders, end quote. She ended her letter with a message of spiritual reassurance and praised the efforts made by the congregation thus far. While the period between the introduction of the law of associations and Collignon's subsequent order had been an extended period of uncertainty for the congregation, the enforcement of the order of July of 1902 was almost immediate. Police, gendarmes, and soldiers were dispatched across the department to remove the sisters from the schools. From the outset, the government faced resistance from local populations, who saw the expulsions as an attack on religious freedoms and the region's deeply felt Catholic faith. Historian Joël Cornette has claimed that Combes' attack on congregations, quote, deeply distressed numerous in that such policies seemed to attack the very roots of their identity, religiously, clerically, and linguistically, end quote. But the biggest question of all weighing on the minds of the Bretons was, as the prefect Collignon would later acknowledge, what would be the fate of the region's children if they could no longer receive a Christian education? Congregational documents revealed the emotional and physical toll of the expulsion for the women of the congregation. Local superior of the congregation's branch in Crozon, Sir Anne de Jésus, wrote to her superior, Sir Saint-Georges, on the 11th of August, announcing that, quote, voilà, your fille of Crozon expelled after a siege of 8 days. Lasting more than a week, the expulsion of the Crozon sisters was a devastating moment for Sir Anne, who was elderly and frail at 80 years old, and who had lived and worked in the commune as the head of the school since 1853. And Sir Anne's letter recounts the dramatic scenes that took place on the streets outside of her school, where each day for the entirety of the siege, sirens sounded and the bells of the nearby convent rang, alerting villagers to the injustice that was taking place at the heart of their community. Of the support received by the women, Anne wrote to her superior that, quote, the peasants rushed to assemble before the doors of the school of St. Anne. The priests were among them. While many commentators of the protest questioned the presence of peasant protesters and were shocked at the ways in which peasants threatened the ruin of crops as a bargaining tool, Anne claimed that the peasants justified their decision as such, quote, we would prefer to lose our harvests than the souls of our children. As the crowds surrounding the school in Crozon continued to grow over the course of the week, so too did the police force. After 8 long days, the order was finally given by the prefect to enter the premises and remove the women. 20 gendarmes, 200 soldiers, 3 commissioners, and a locksmith assisted in the removal. After half an hour attempting to break down the main door to the school, the troops eventually succeeded. Hidden inside were the 4 local sisters. Despite the deteriorating health of their superior, the sisters maintained a steady and exhausting resistance for the entirety of the expulsion. In her letter, Soeurs de Jésus assured her superior that the Croisonnes sisters surrendered their school and home only by force. As the sisters exited the building in tears, they were greeted by their supporters who chanted, "Vive les Soeurs, vive la liberté." While chaos ensued on the streets surrounding the schools held by the Filles du Saint-Esprit, for the most part, the women themselves maintained a pious and stoic public silence throughout the period of expulsions. As instructed by their superior in her circular letter in July, they also remained in their homes and refused to leave except under force. In a report for the ministry at Paris, the prefect Collignon noted that when the police arrived in Concarneau to remove the Filles du Saint-Esprit, they had been hidden in the cellar under the kitchen. Then, once discovered, they made another attempt to remain in the home by hiding elsewhere on the grounds. Having long been central figures in village life, the Filles du Saint-Esprit were determined to remain so despite the chaos that surrounded them. The Filles du Saint-Esprit were not the only female congregation in France to use this method throughout the expulsions. Sarah Curtis's examination of the Lyon-based congregation, the Soeurs de Saint-Joseph, showed how these women too remained in their homes while protests took place outside their schools. The Filles du Saint-Esprit did not resort to violence and displays of anger like their supporters, but rather they chose a passive, though no less telling, method of silent resistance. On the face of it, these congregational women presented themselves as above the discussions taking place in Paris. Their sole mission was to serve the community. But in the case of 1902, the absence of statement could be similarly telling. James Scott's examination of peasant rebellion demonstrated how resistance does not have to take physical or violent forms to carry meaning. Though the Filles du Saint-Esprit were not the same as Scott's disenfranchised peasants, they too used forms of passive non-compliance to disrupt and complicate the actions of government. Throughout the century, the Filles du Saint-Esprit showed themselves to be engaged political actors through their roles as teachers and for their integration into local Breton movements. Crozon's superior, Soeurs de Jésus, became a figure of some notoriety in the region for her writings on Breton history. In her early years in the congregation, she also courted controversy for her political protests. In 1858, for example, she removed the bust of the Emperor Louis Napoleon from the local town hall. This event was labelled by both local and national authorities as a form of legitimate protest and as a direct attack on the person of the emperor. As a result, Soeurs de Jésus' congregational career, as well as that of other members of her local religious community, was placed in jeopardy, as government officials called for the closure of her school. What this demonstrates is that when women religious acted in such a manner that defied government authority, the consequences were serious. As a response to these limitations and broader anti-clerical suspicion affecting congregations, throughout the 19th century, women religious in France often developed subtle methods for both professional and social autonomy, as well as political inclusion within wider French society. This was a universal method that applied to female congregations across France, and could be as simple as using non-confrontational language when addressing male superiors, as Yvonne Turan's work brought to light, or in the case of 1902, maintaining silence and piety while still refusing calls to submit. Sir Saint-Georges' advice to the congregation was for the women, once forced from their schools, to exit with dignity and to show no recognition of laws which would forbid them from occupying their homes. Such actions presented these women as passive actors and contributed to the understanding amongst themselves and the Breton population of this event as a persecution of a group of women who only had intentions to help the poor children of their villages. But it was also a demonstration of political intent and a deliberate and premeditated tactic on the part of the congregation. The way in which the Filles du Saint-Esprit, amongst other congregations across France, resisted the law of associations, challenged government understandings of the relationship between religious women and modernity. Carol Harrison has demonstrated that anti-clericals, most notably Jules Michelet, argued that the nature of faith and female devotion fundamentally limited women from participation in modern French society. Public religious devotion was a deliberate rejection of modernity and the principles that underpinned the existence of the French nation as the government understood it. While the key objective of both the Filles du Saint-Esprit and their supporters in the summer of 1902 was the protection of traditional values and practices, as Evelyn Bowers argued in her examination of religious violence in Brittany at the fin de siècle, its effects were inherently modern. Through their resistance to the law of associations, congregational women participated in the political life of Republican society and took steps towards becoming active citizens, despite both their ultimate rejection of such principles and societal norms that excluded women from such activities. Despite the dramatic closure of their schools in the summer of 1902, the Filles du Saint-Esprit soon reopened their schools with the support of private donations and funds. Until separation in 1905, the number of Breton girls being educated by nuns continued to increase. In this sense, Combe's attack on religion in Brittany was unsuccessful, as the church, congregational women, and ordinary people joined together to fight for their schools and for religious liberty as they understood it. However, this was not to last, as the forces of anti-clerical legislation became too strong for female congregations to withstand. The fight between the French government and the defenders of the Filles du Saint-Esprit during the summer of 1902 in Brittany ultimately concerned questions of modernity and the place of religion and tradition within modern post-revolutionary France. For government authorities and policymakers, religious congregations were, by their nature, an archaic phenomenon and incompatible with the secular values of the Third Republic. The means of resistance during the expulsion suggested, however, that women religious had, by the end of the century, developed a form of engagement with the political sphere in France that placed them in a unique position between both tradition and modernity. The case study of 1902 also revealed a much larger story of 19th century France and the way in which women made a place for themselves in this society. Such events reveal the way in which women religious during the 19th century were able to use their professions within congregations as means for greater engagement with French political life. As such, women religious were also representative of a broader shift in the nature of women's professions and participation in politics, as they occupied a unique space in the political landscape of 19th century France, challenging anti-clerical understandings of feminine piety and political action. Thank you.